So my introductory speech, and I will try not to spoil your lunch with it, but would be to remind you a little bit about MiFID, because not all of you have lived in the first MiFID stage, the original MiFID stage, which has now morphed, of course, in MiFID II and MiFIR. But the original intention in the MiFID I was to put an end to the centralized market system that existed pre-2004 and has been now totally abolished, as we know. The concern at that time was that the markets were much more expensive, and I remember very clearly at that time, the markets and the costs of execution was much higher than it was, for instance, in the US, and therefore competition was organized. The other point was that in terms of integration of European financial markets, at that time the markets were national, and there were silos in each national market, silos not only for trading but also for post-trade. The silo form was the prevalent one. And then MiFID intervened and put an end to all of this. And it has had very fundamental consequences, MiFID I. And I will list a few of them, and you will certainly recognize them. They are still among us, and they are still the main lines of the present market structure. And the first one is, I think very clearly, where trading before was centralized, now it has become entirely decentralized, decomposed. You have trading in all corners, and it is very difficult to have a clear view on the market as such. And this creates a certain number of issues. We have, of course, many execution, not only execution sites, but also many techniques of execution, many forms of execution. Then we have seen this considerable rise of the OTC markets, so this was quite a big change. The level of competition between the markets has increased substantially, but the question is, has this competition benefited the final investor? Has it benefited the institutional investor? And the answer to that question is at least mixed, if not negative. And we know that there is a real concern from the regulatory side that is quite substantial changes have been not so beneficial to the final investor as we expected. There is also a question on integration. We see today that markets are not local anymore. Before you had all the French shares being traded in France. Today they can be traded in different trading venues, and you see quite some arbitrage going on. I think we see that the markets interact, but they do not only interact in Europe, they interact worldwide. And I think all of you are struck by the fact that if Tokyo in the early morning is going down or going up, immediately you see some reactions over here. So that's the integration is now not only European, it is also to a large extent a worldwide integration. The other issue is that with the dislocation of the trading venues, we see that regulating of the markets and certainly getting information on what's going on has become extremely difficult. And that's one of the topics that will keep us busy. That is the pre-trade, post-trade transparency, but I will deal a little bit on the post-trade side. But there is a real issue for the regulators. I'm now talking with my previous regulator's hat, and you will excuse me. That's the experience I have. You have a much richer experience than I. But that it is difficult to get your hands on the data. And for instance, in trade reporting, you know that we still are not there. Transactions are reported that are not transactions, that are in fact transmission of transaction from one broker to the other. So it is, the data we have are still not very clear. And therefore, I think work has to be done. I'm talking here about the post-trade, that means the consolidated tape. There too, we have nothing, and it's absolutely amazing that the new proposals are, to say the least, are very weak and are very much relying on the spontaneous market forces. I may not have seen the final proposals, Mr. Schmidt, but let me say that up to now they are very vague, and I hope that the markets will come forward. I remember in my times at CISA, the idea was if the market does not come forward, we will mandate it, we will impose it, because probably it's going to be the only solution. You know, the competition in the markets would prevent that. So difficulty to regulate, difficulty to create some new dynamism in the market, for instance on trade reporting. So there is a problem there. And then I would just mention a few other points, which is best execution. Best execution is, of course, one of the cardinal notions in MiFID, and rightly so. But if you see how it works in practice, it is amazing. There are very few mechanisms that ensure best execution price-wise. Of course, we know we have diluted the idea of best execution. I think the Americans have been much more consequential. But we have diluted and say best execution, taking into account all the circumstances, including the cost related to clearing and settlement and all the rest of the stuff. Consequence, if you look in practice, what it means best execution doesn't feel very much. So I think we have to be very clear that the only criterion we have which is credible is the price, and we have no mechanism to verify whether the transaction which is executed on trading platform 1 or trading platform 2 is compared with trading platform 3, what should have been the case. But unfortunately, it is difficult to organize. My last point, more or less, is the dark pools. This is an awful terminology. By the way, we are committing the same mistake by calling some parts of the market shadow banking. So we immediately put on a negative label. I mean, if you look what are dark pools, they are not negative, but there are specific trading venues that probably should have been brought to the fore much earlier. And I will stick it here. Let me just say a few things that in the market organization, which are now being proposed, there are quite some interesting points. And we will discuss these, and I will not, of course, preempt on what the discussion is going to give. I have some question marks, and I have to be critical. The first question mark I have is on the systematic internalizers. You remember that in the original MiFID, there was a lot of attention paid and a lot of discussion went into systematic internalizers. Unfortunately, that too was not a great success. I don't know how many we have, but it is something between 10 and 20, if ever. And the activity that is taking place is not overwhelming. And now again, I see that a lot of attention is paid to systematic internalizer. I mean, the regime is entirely revamped, and therefore it is, in my view, not very convincing. We should probably focus much more on the other trading venues, the OTFs, which there will be discussed, of course, very extensively.